Good evening. I did not intend for it to be 2 weeks in between, but 2 weeks ago we started looking at an overview of the book of Genesis, intending to finish that last week, but of course we cannot control the weather and sometimes can't even predict the weather. But looking at back in the book of Genesis, and I've got I'd looked at maybe something related to looking at the term used for God several times in the book of Genesis, really in all of the Old Testament, but you see it, of course, first in Genesis, Elohim. I've looked at some material relative to that. I thought about something pertinent to Noah's salvation, comparing that with salvation today. Also from Genesis 26, redigging wells. And I'd also thought about looking at something maybe from Genesis 33, when Jacob and Esau are reunited. They meet up again. And also thought about something maybe from Genesis 45 with Joseph dealing with his brethren and his forgiveness extended toward his brethren. I say all that just to say I've got several things in mind that I thought about. If you got something in particular among those, maybe there's a different passage or chapter or something in Genesis, let me know. Again, this was something that was requested from at least from someone in the youth, because of this Genesis being the theme for Last Leaders, and of course the whole book of Genesis being the theme for the Bible Bowl. But one of my children said something to me, who I will let them retain their anonymity. But one of them said to me last week, or 2 weeks ago, upon walking in and seeing me saving the PowerPoint and finishing that up, said, "Genesis? I'm already tired of Genesis." I said, "Well, so much for, tell me the old story. I just can't hear it enough." So I said, "Well, you know what? There may be others that feel that way. So if I don't hear from anybody, I'll just take that as nobody wants the lessons from Genesis." But I did that originally because I had that request in the Q&A box. So if I finish the overview and there's no other feedback from anybody, that we can leave it at that, I'm okay with that. I had thought about that because I knew that was something that the young folks were studying. But when one of my youngins said that, I thought, well, that could be how everybody else feels too. So either way, I'd love to hear from you and see what I know. You never please everybody, but be that as it may, I would like to do what, if it's something that is of interest to other folks, and particularly the young folks, then that's what that was my idea from the get-go with this. So that said, let's finish up our overview of Genesis. We started this 2 weeks ago, and I won't rehash everything. You see we pointed out, if you wanted to just really break down Genesis to perhaps the most basic divisions, it's chapters 1 through 11, chapters 12 through 50. 1 through 11, you have these four great events: creation, the fall of man, the flood, and then the Tower of Babel and the dispersing or scattering of the nations. And so that's from the creation of the world and mankind and all things up to the call of Abraham. And of course, chapter 12 begins with the call of Abraham. And so chapters 12 through 50 will be the history of the patriarchs. We pointed out chapters 12 through 50, four great people. Have four great events in those first 11 chapters, four great people in the last chapters 12 through 50, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Now, again, we noticed this last week, over half the Old Testament timeline is covered in the book of Genesis. Something like 2,000 plus years covered just in those first 11 chapters. So it covers a lot of time, but when you get to chapter 12, again, we said this 2 weeks ago, sort of slam on the brakes. So with that, we began looking at just a quick summation of each chapter, and we got We looked at that first section, chapters 1 through 11, and then beginning at chapter 12 with the call of Abraham, we left off with the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot and his daughters are spared. You see the beginning of the nations of Moab and Ammon with just perverse behavior from Lot's daughters that Lot was able to save his life, his daughters' lives. There are things that they no doubt would have picked up on in Sodom, some of the perversion and things, and you see some of that even there in chapter 19. But that said, let's pick up right where we left off and go into chapter 20, and we'll move quickly through these because, as you know, when you get to chapter 37, you sort of hit the brakes again in Genesis. At chapter 12, you really slow down and you go from this wide-angle picture, so to speak, to this zoomed-in view of Jacob's descendants. And then when you get to Abraham's descendants. And when you get to chapter 37, you zoom in even further to Jacob's descendants, and really particularly Joseph. But it's, of course, giving us the background for the next book, Exodus, how God's people ended up in Egypt. And God, of course, sparing his people. But chapter 20, you have Abraham and Abimelech. Abraham once again says of Sarah, she's my sister. And he sort of tries to weasel his way out of it, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful toward Abraham, but let's understand, Abraham, great man of faith that he was, and he was, friend of God that he was, and he certainly was, but he was still human. And so he's worried. Well, they're gonna kill me for you, Sarah. So you wherever we go, you just tell them he's my brother. And so he lied to Abimelech years ago. I'm talking like this would not have been long at all after Reagan and I got married. So, let's just leave it at a few years ago. There was two gentlemen, and back when people had the email lists or email groups, Yahoo groups and things like that. And there was one where people would debate, like written debates. And, there were debates on all kinds of things. But it was very interesting to read because some of these were just Bible questions that maybe were not of any kind of eternal consequence as far as some kind of matter of fellowship or salvation. But, some of them were. But these two guys, they debated, did Abraham sin in lying to Abimelech? And I don't think I'll ever forget it, just because this one guy that I knew him, he was a preacher of the gospel, and I'd never heard him preach anything other than the truth. But this guy, the mental gymnastics he went through to try to defend what the Bible simply records. The Bible doesn't defend it. The Bible just records that Abraham said, she's my sister. He deceived Abimelech. This is the second time. He did this also in Egypt, as you recall. But this guy just went through all kind of hoops and gymnastics trying to defend and say Abraham did not do anything wrong. And what we sometimes, if we're not careful, we put Bible characters so far up here that we forget they're humans and they make mistakes just like anybody else. Abraham's faith was growing, but he didn't just start off with his faith, just up there at the level 100, maxed out. He's growing, and sometimes he made mistakes. The only person that we can put up on that pedestal and never be disappointed in is Jesus Christ. So Abraham, he has that interaction there with Abimelech, and God ends up appearing to Abimelech in a dream and says, you better stay away from that lady. She is another man's wife. And Abimelech calls Abraham, and you got in a very ironic situation because you got a man who is not God's, in that special relationship with God like Abraham was, and he's rebuking the one who is in that special relationship with God. He says, hey man, what are you doing? You told me she was your sister. How am I taking her for my wife and suffered greatly because of you not even telling me the truth? So you see that in chapter 20. There's more we can say about that. We better move on. Chapter 21, Isaac is born. God had been telling Abraham, you're going to have a son. He had Sarah, who says, here, take Hagar, my handmaid. Ishmael was born. God says, not Ishmael. That's not your heir. Your heir will be a child of yours and Sarah's. So Isaac is finally born. Well, one day Ishmael is mocking. We're not given any kind of real detail about that, but maybe we might say picking on Isaac, because he would have been older, of course. That upset Sarah. She says, send Hagar and Ishmael away. God assures them he's going to look after them as well, but they are sent out because in Isaac thy seed shall be called, God says. Chapter 22 is Abraham's test of faith. God says, take your son whom you love, go to the Mount of Moriah and offer him. God never intended, of course, for him to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. This was a test. And when Abraham drew back his hand, God calls out to him, tells him to stop. God renews that promise to Abraham, chapter 22, verse 18. In thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice. Chapter 23, Sarah dies at the age of 127 years old. Abraham buries her in this cave of Machpelah that he bought from Ephron, the Hittite, and others there. But he buys this cave and he buries her there, and really the better part of Abraham's family and descendants, at least for a few generations, are going to be buried there. Chapter 24, Abraham sends his servant away to find a wife for Isaac. He says, I'm not letting my son marry someone who's a Canaanite, someone from within this land. He's not prejudiced against Canaanites. He's not racist toward Canaanites. It's because they were idolatrous. And he said, my son is going to marry someone who is a child of God. And so the servant goes and he asks God for help. God providentially helps him. Isaac ends up marrying Rebekah. And so then you move into chapter 25, and Abraham dies at the age of 175 years old. Jacob and Esau are born to Isaac in this chapter. And we have the incident where Esau sells his birthright. He comes in from hunting. Oh, he's so hungry, starving to death. We've all been there, right? You just feel like, if I don't eat, I'm just going to die. And Jacob says, of course, you recall the name Jacob means supplanter. And Jacob could be downright sneaky. And Jacob says, you can have some of this soup, just sell me your birthright. How hungry are you, Esau? And Esau's just rationalizing to himself, well, what good is my birthright if I'm dead, if I'm starving to death? And so the book of Hebrews tells us over in the New Testament, he despised his birthright. He didn't have his priorities right. And so he lost his birthright there, selling it to Jacob for a bowl of soup. Chapter 26, you got God's promise to Abraham. It's repeated here now to Isaac. You have an incident with Isaac and Abimelech there in Gerar. You want to know what Isaac does? He goes in there and he tells Abimelech, this beautiful lady he's married to, Rebekah, and he says, she's my sister. Hey, dads, reckon where he learned that? You think our kids are watching? You think our kids are learning from us and seeing what we do? Again, Abraham wasn't perfect. Isaac wasn't perfect. These are human beings, and they made mistakes. But they're recorded there so we can learn from them and not make the same mistakes. And so, again, Abimelech ends up reproving him. Then you have the incident in chapter 27 where Rebekah comes to Jacob. Now, we're told that, of course, Isaac has twin sons, Jacob and Esau. and Isaac, boy, he was crazy about Esau. He loved Esau. And kind of had a favorite, Esau. But Mama kind of had a favorite too. Her favorite was Jacob. And how'd that turn out? There's going to be a lot of problems from that. And interestingly, I don't think it's a spoiler for anybody here. When you get to chapter 37, you're going to find out Jacob had a favorite in Joseph. Again, daddies, Are we listening? Our children pick up on things, and they a lot of times tend to imitate us. And boy, it's a constant reminder that we need to be aware of our example that we set before our children. So Isaac sends Esau to go and get some venison so that he could bless him before he dies. He's without getting real detailed into this, it seems that he's ill or something is wrong. And of course, we were told his eyesight specifically is terrible. He's nearly blind at this point. But he thinks he's going to die. And when you read the rest of, on to, I was trying to remember what exactly chapter. Anyway, we'll come to it in a moment. But by the time you get to the chapter and the section of Genesis where Isaac dies, it's on down the road a ways. I mean, Jacob's going to end up leaving. He's going to work 7 years for Rachel. Well, for Leah. And then 7 more for Rachel. So it's at least 14 more years. But when you read this in chapter 27, it's like Isaac sends out Esau and says, hey, I'm nearing death. Go out, get some venison, come back. I'm going to bless you, give you the blessing before I die. So whatever it was, he seemed to think he was at death's door, or at least getting there. But probably, most logical answer will be he recovered and ended up living for several years more. But of course, Rebekah comes to Jacob and she says, I got this plan. They deceive Isaac. And again, there's no two ways about it. Jacob lied to his father. I mean, his father's going to say, who are you? Oh, I'm Esau. Well, that's a lie. He says it sounds like Jacob. It smells like, and of course she'd given him that goat's hair to put on his hands and the nape of his neck. It feels like Esau, but sounds like Jacob. Are you Esau? I am. He lied to him. And of course, he's barely gone out from receiving the blessing, which he did receive the blessing, Jacob did. Barely gone out, and Esau comes. And as you can imagine, listen, any of you who have boys, you can imagine this is not pretty. And I mean, Esau is, as we say back home, he's fit to be tied. Or one of my mom's favorite expressions, mad as an old wet hen. He is angry. And he says, I tell you what, it's not going to be long. Daddy's going to die. Again, you see that they think he's close to death. He says, and when he's dead, we just get past the days of mourning, and Jacob, he's done. I mean, he's so mad, he plans, he's going to kill him. Well, Rebekah hears about that, and that's her baby boy, And so she's not okay with that. So she says, we're going to send Jacob away to go find a wife. Don't want him marrying one of these heathens in the land, these Canaanites. By the way, you know what Esau does when he finds out mom and dad don't like the idea of us marrying a Canaanite woman? He marries a Canaanite woman. How did that work out for him? You don't ever get ahead by doing stuff out of spite. But he decides, I'm just going to spite mom and dad and just go marry somebody that's going to upset them. Well, you're just hurting yourself there, Esau. So Jacob goes away. He's sent away, and he goes away to find a wife. And of course, as we said, he ends up with Leah and Rachel. But God's promise to Abraham is now repeated to Jacob, chapter 28. Jacob marries Leah. He falls in love with Rachel. He wants to marry her. Her father says, Laban says, hey, 7 years, work for me, and you can marry my daughter. He does. He's tricked. He ends up marrying Rachel, or Leah. And so then another 7 years he works for Rachel. And then also in this chapter we see the birth of Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. When you get to chapter 29, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Dinah, and Joseph are born. Chapter 31, Jacob is going to leave his father-in-law, Laban, to return back home. He's headed back to home. When you get to chapter 32, he's approaching. Some of his people come back and they say, hey, Esau is coming to meet you. Oh. And if you are Jacob, you can imagine how that would feel. And it's not just, oh, Esau's coming to meet you. They say Esau's coming to meet you, and he's got 400 men with him. Oh. So Jacob's kind of terrified. He's dividing people up into groups, and he's sending a gift with each one. Maybe we can butter him up with this gift, and if something does happen, we're in separate companies, and so, you guys run this way and y'all run that way, and maybe we can escape that way. He's got all these elaborate plans. He sends them on, and he spends the night there, and you have this dream and this wrestling with the angel of Jacob, and you seem to see a change in Jacob's behavior after this, by the way. His name is changed to Israel, Prince of God, or he who prevails with God. It means something along those lines. Chapter 33, Jacob and Esau are reunited. Again, I was thinking about doing a lesson on this, and maybe I guess, like I said, I'll wait and see what folks' thoughts are on that. But for now, we'll just suffice it to say this was a happy reunion. It did not go anything like Jacob feared it would. It turned out quite well, and that was certainly great to see. They were peacefully reunited. Esau kind of says, forgive and forget. And of course, the irony is their descendants, they didn't get the memo or something, because the nation of Edom, descendants of Esau, and the Israelites were just constantly at each other. They did not get along, basically from the get-go. But Jacob and Esau, they made up. They hugged it out, as we say. Chapter 34, Dinah is defiled by this fellow Shechem. Simeon and Levi plot revenge and take revenge for their sister. A very sneaky, albeit very effective, revenge. Chapter 35, God blesses Jacob. Benjamin is born. Rachel dies giving birth to Benjamin. In fact, she calls him, originally I think it was Ben-Oni, son of my sorrow, is the name that she gave her son. And Jacob says, no, that's not his name. His name is Benjamin. It means son of the right hand, power. And of course, his love for Rachel was tremendous, and probably is part of why he named him Benjamin, son of the right hand. Isaac dies, chapter 35. There it is. I was looking for it earlier. Chapter 35, Isaac's death is recorded at the age of 180. So Isaac dies. Again, this is several years removed from when he originally was thinking he would die. And then in chapter 36, you have these generations of Esau that are listed. And when you get to chapter 37, you sort of zoom in further, and the text begins to focus in on Joseph and Jacob's sons and descendants, but especially Joseph. So Joseph is the favorite son, of course. He's favored by Jacob. He's hated by his brothers. He tells them his dreams. I don't know. I've speculated this before, and I will freely admit it's speculation. I don't know, and I've sometimes thought, maybe this is how it was, maybe not. I don't know, but it's just always sort of made me chuckle. It's not like a ha-ha thing. It's not really funny. It's just interesting, ironic, I guess. If you have these dreams of your brothers bowing down to you, like doing obeisance before you, even a dream, sun, moon, stars, your parents and your brethren falling down and doing obeisance before you, and you're already not really very liked by your brothers because, you're daddy's favorite. I don't know, man. It just seems like maybe it's not the best idea to tell them those dreams. But Joseph does, and it makes them hate him even more. And the text says they couldn't even speak peaceably to him. He's sent by his father to go check on his brothers. They see him coming, and they say, oh, look, here comes the dreamer. You could just hear the sarcasm in their voice as they say that. And they decide, we're going to kill him. And Reuben is sort of like, whoa, hold the phone here. Kill him? That's too far. Let's put him in this pit over here. So Reuben's sort of, I guess we would say maybe buying time. He's got to figure out a way to get him back home to his dad, because they're taking this like to a whole nother level. I don't like him either. being Dad's favorite and all, but I mean, they're talking about killing him. But for whatever reason, we're not told exactly, but Reuben ends up away, and while Reuben is away, here comes some Ishmaelite traders, and they say, look, why kill him? I mean, he's our brother, flesh and blood. Plus, hey, we can make some money for him. So 20 pieces of silver, they sell him to those Ishmaelites. He ends up in Egypt in the house of this fella, Potiphar. And it goes from, kind of bad to worse, at least for a little bit for Joseph before it gets better. Now, chapter 38, you have kind of an interlude. Judah's got 2 sons that die because of their ungodly lives and then their ungodly behavior. Judah deceives Tamar, telling her he'll give her his youngest son, but he never did. He deceived her, she deceived him, and Pharez and Zerah were born. And you see they end up in the lineage of the Messiah. This is not all just, peaches and cream. These are real people, and they made mistakes, and sometimes their lives were ugly. The families were sometimes dysfunctional, and sometimes they did just dumb things. Sometimes they did immoral things and wicked things, and many of them served God, but sometimes they made mistakes. Back to Joseph, he ends up in Potiphar's house. Potiphar favors him. In fact, he puts basically everything under Joseph's hand in his control, but Joseph ends up in prison because Potiphar's wife decides, I like him. And so she begins to try to seduce him. And Joseph, he's just determined, I'm going to be faithful to the Lord. I'm going to do what's right. How can I do this great thing? He says, a sin against God. It would have been a sin against her. Sure. It would have been a sin against his own body. Sure. It would have been a sin against Potiphar. Absolutely. But he realizes ultimately it was a sin against God. But she's not satisfied with that. And one day she grabs a hold of him. He just takes off, and he just leaves that coat in her hand, and she just decides this isn't working, and now she's angry. And she holds on to that. And when her husband comes home, she says, well, this fellow you brought in here and you've promoted him, and all he's trying to do is force me. He tried to rape me. And so now Joseph ends up in prison. Even in prison, though, he's favored. Then one day Pharaoh puts his baker, his butler, in prison. They've fallen out of favor with Pharaoh, and then they have these dreams, this baker and this butler. First, the butler tells his dream. Joseph says, there's a God in heaven. He can reveal the meaning of dreams. And I can tell you what your dream means. It means in 3 days, you're going to be restored. There's going to be a party, and Pharaoh's going to lift up your head, and you're going to be restored back to being Pharaoh's butler. And again, it's not a ha-ha funny thing. It's just sort of interesting to me because the baker says what? I mean, he hears that, and he's like, hey, man, let me tell you my dream. Maybe you can interpret mine. And Joseph says, yes, God has revealed your dream, the meaning of it as well. And the meaning of your dream is in 3 days, your head's going to be lifted up, as in you're going to be hanged. And sure enough, it happened just like that. And Joseph tells that butler, hey, listen, when you were restored back to faithful service, remember me. I haven't done anything. Potiphar's wife, she lied about me, and here I am, and it's just been one thing after another in my life, and I'm just trying to do what's right. I'm trying to help. I've helped you. Remember me. But of course, the butler forgets him. When you get to chapter 41, Pharaoh has these dreams. Joseph interprets them. The butler finally, when Pharaoh has these dreams, and he's just vexed because he's like, what do they mean? You got the 7 just really healthy, fat cattle that come up out of the river, and then you got 7 that are just sickly and just gaunt. They come up, they devour the fat ones, but they don't get any fatter. They don't get any healthier looking. Same thing with the King James says corn, wheat, the grain. You got these 7 healthy heads of grain, 7 that are sickly, blasted by the wind. They come and devour the healthy ones, but they don't look any better for it. And the butler kind of goes, oh, yeah, I remember now that guy in prison. You need to send for him. He can tell you He told me about what my dream meant. Said I was going to be restored. Here I am. He said the baker was going to end up being hanged. That's what happened. So they send for Joseph, and he tells, you had the dream, two things, but the dream is one. It happened twice to show you the certainty of it, Pharaoh. Kind of like a repetitive thing, we might say. And it's going to shortly come to pass. He says it's 7 years of plenty. Oh, bumper crops are coming. But I'm going to tell you something. After that, it's going to be 7 years of famine that are going to be so bad, you won't remember those 7 plentiful years. And Pharaoh, I'm telling you, here's what you need to do. You need to start saving. During the plentiful years, save up grain so that when the famine hits, you got something to fall back on. You can use that. And put somebody in charge of that. And of course, Pharaoh says, hey, who would be better to put in charge of that than this guy that could interpret these dreams? And so, I mean, it just goes from like one bad thing after another for Joseph to all of a sudden Pharaoh says, hey, the only thing you're going to be behind me in, Joseph, is the throne. Otherwise, you are second in command. And if anybody needs anything relative to food during this time, it's you. You're going to have a chariot, and you're going to be, I mean, he is powerful. And so, the 7 years come, they go, and then the famine hits. It even gets down there into the land of Canaan. So Joseph's brothers go to Egypt to buy grain. And again, there's so much more we can say about this, but Joseph, he knows who they are, but they don't know who he is. And he speaks to them through an interpreter, and he says, you're spies. You've come down here to spy out our land. Oh, no, they assure him. And he asked about them, and they told him about having a father, and they told him about how they had a younger son, but he had stayed home, that younger son being Benjamin, of course. He says, I tell you what, you say you're not spies. Well, you can prove it. You bring your younger brother back here. Now, don't you know that had to seem strange to them? Why on earth would he say that? But that's what he said. And he says, but I'm keeping one of you. So Simeon is detained. Well, they go home and they tell their daddy, Jacob, what happened. And Jacob is sort of like, absolutely not. I mean, Joseph's gone. They had told Joseph that he'd been, they put some, he killed an animal, put blood on Joseph's coat of many colors. Told Jacob that he'd been killed by some wild animal. My son Joseph, I'll get it in a minute. He says, my son Joseph is dead. And now Simeon has been detained in Egypt. There's no way you're taking Benjamin. Forget it. He won't do it. He won't let him go. Well, eventually, the time goes on, and Jacob says, hey, we got to have some grain, fellas. And they said, they sort of say to their daddy, I'm paraphrasing it a little bit, of course, but they essentially say, hello, we've already told you. He said we can't see his face again unless we bring our younger son. And finally, Judah steps up and he says, listen, I will answer for him. And you can lay that on me if anything happens to him. But Dad, we're going to starve to death if we don't go get grain. And if we hadn't delayed this long, we could have already been and gotten back. And so finally, Jacob consents and says, fine, take him. And if I'm bereaved of him, I'm just bereaved of him. And Judah says, I'm going to answer for him. Now that's significant because Joseph, of course, is going to test his brothers there in chapter 44. And eventually he's going to reveal himself to them. He tests them because he puts his special cup in Benjamin's sack as they're leaving. After he's had lunch with them, they leave, and he sends his steward out, and the steward stops him and says, hey, you've stolen from my master. Why would you do such a thing? And they all say, absolutely not. You find this thing in any of our stuff, and the one that's stolen it, he'll die, and we'll be your servants. And the steward says, so be it. And so they start to search, and they search from the oldest down to the youngest. And there it is, right where Joseph had planted it. And this is not Joseph trying to be vengeful. He's testing them. They find the cup. And oh man, they tear their clothes in grief and agony. And back they go to Joseph's house. And they say, look, we are your servants. And Joseph says, no. There's no we. Y'all are not my servants. He is my servant. He took the cup. He will stay and be my servant. And Judah steps up and he says, you remember when you asked us about our family? He said, our dad, he didn't want to let him go. And he said, I stood up and I said, Dad, I will answer for him. And if anything happens to him, it'll be my life for his. I will make sure he comes home to you. And he says, if you send us back without our little brother, you'll send our dad to the grave. And I can't allow that. I will be your servant in his place. And I said that's significant because way back there in chapter 37, it was Judah who says, let's sell him to those Ishmaelites. And now Judah says, don't let anything happen to my little brother. You put this on me. I will take his, whatever punishment you want to impose, I'll take it. And Joseph knows they've changed. And you can just picture it. Joseph, I mean, he's struggling emotionally. He's getting torn up inside. And I could just picture Joseph saying, out, everybody out. And he sends all those Egyptians out. And he just comes apart emotionally. And he weeps. And he's reunited with his brothers. He reveals himself to them finally. And long story short, he ends up sending for Jacob, his father, to come to Egypt. Jacob comes to Egypt. Jacob and Joseph are reunited, a very touching scene there as well in chapter 46. Chapter 47, Jacob and his family settle in Goshen. Jacob instructs them regarding his burial. Jacob blesses his sons, Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Ephraim is set before Manasseh, which upsets Joseph a little bit because Ephraim is the younger, Manasseh is the older. But this is a prophetic thing happening here because Ephraim is going to be greater and larger, and even you even see that with the tribes. Ephraim is a much larger tribe than Manasseh. By the way, have you ever wondered the 12 tribes of Israel? But the Levites didn't have an inheritance. The Lord was their inheritance. You see this when you get into the giving of the law. They didn't have an inheritance. There wasn't a land allotment to Levi. They had those cities of refuge and Levitical cities dispersed throughout the land, but they didn't have a tribal inheritance. But there was still 12 allotments. Well, Joseph's sons, Joseph got a double portion. And so there was a tribe for Ephraim, a tribe for Manasseh. In fact, Jacob says to Joseph, your sons, they're like mine. Inheritance and all that, they're like mine. And so that's why there is a tribe of Ephraim and a tribe of Manasseh, even though there's not a son of Jacob named Ephraim or Manasseh. Technically, those were his grandsons. And then in chapter 49, Jacob blesses his sons. He prophesies concerning their futures. Jacob then dies, and you see the mourning and the burial for Jacob in chapter 50. Joseph is kind to his brothers even after all of that. They're scared to death. Dad has died, and he's been nice to us for Dad's sake, but now Dad is gone, and he's not going to restrain himself. And so they come to him, and they say, now Dad wanted to be sure you knew. He didn't want you holding this against us. And Joseph says, look, I'm not in the place of God. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And he forgives them. I want to show you something here before we wrap up. I threw this in here because I knew I'd forget it. I'm glad I did. I bought this several years ago, a PowerPoint presentation version of this. We may have these even in our workroom. I'm not sure, Jan, but I bought the PowerPoint version several years ago. Sometimes I'll use them in Bible time with our kids, young or old. They're great. They're little summary cards, and there's one card for each book of the Bible. And they have visual stuff and just, obviously one card per one book. When you get a book like Genesis, you're not going to be able to do anything but hit the high points. But I just wanted to show you the one for Genesis and give you an idea of kind of what these are like. But they're very good. And if I understand correctly, I need to do a little bit more research. But if I understand correctly on their website, you can have this on multiple computers, so we could probably have a church copy of these if to use in other settings. But you see, this is the card for Genesis. You got Adam and Eve there with the one for the first man, first woman, first marriage, and all the different firsts that you see early in Genesis. You got the ark floating on the water there, Noah's ark. You got these tents, Abraham wandering around in the land of Canaan. 3 promises. God made 3 promises to Abraham, remember? A nation, Israel, land, the promised land, and a seed promise. And that's why you got the cross there, because Galatians 3:16 says that is Jesus Christ. And of course you got Joseph there with his coat of many colors, and he ends up going into Egypt. But that's just a sampling of what you'll see, and there's one of those for every book of the Bible, just kind of a visual representation. And then on the flip side of the cards, if you have the actual hard copy cards, on the flip side it's got some talking points, especially like for children. And if you have the PowerPoint, it's in the notes section of the PowerPoint. But I want to mention that because it really is a good thing to use like Bible time for little ones and stuff like that. But as we sort of wrap up our thoughts here, I just wanted to kind of close out with looking at Joseph, because Joseph is such a great case study in, as I've got it put here, unconditional surrender to God. I mean, think about this. Here's Joseph. He surrendered to God in hard times. I mean, he's betrayed by his brothers. He's hated by his brothers. They sell him into slavery. Then he has these advances from Potiphar's wife. He's imprisoned because of her lies. I mean, can you imagine if you're Joseph and you're sitting here thinking, I just resisted this. I didn't give in. And what's my reward? I did the right thing. And I'm going to prison for it. Not only that, he was forgotten by the butler. But listen, folks, Joseph was surrendered to God in good times as well, because things changed as we just noticed. And here he is, he's made second in command in Egypt. He's got a chance, an easy chance, ample opportunity to get revenge on his brothers, but he doesn't do that. He forgives them. He is really a living, breathing example of Romans 12:1-2. Where Paul there says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Joseph is such a great example of someone who is just unconditionally surrendered to God. And so that's how I want to close out with the question, what about me? What about you? Each of us asking ourselves, what about me? Am I unconditionally surrendered to God? Sometimes we say, you know what? I want to serve God. And if things are going well, I will. But things start going bad, and I start saying, well, I don't know. It feels like God's just turned his back on me. And we forget that, we've mentioned this before. God's never promised anybody at any time, you follow me and you'll never have any kind of trouble in your life. You'll live to be a certain age. You'll never be sick. Nobody will ever persecute you for doing what's right. In fact, it's quite the opposite, right? Sometimes we say, I'll follow God as long as times are good. Sometimes when times are bad, we say, you know what, things are bad in my life and I need God. And then we get past that, but it's not an unconditional surrender, because sometimes we get past that and now things are going well. And it's like, well, I think I'm doing okay now. And we start to get into feeling like we're kind of independent. Let's make sure we follow God. Always. Good times, bad times, unconditional surrender to God. What about you? What about me? Are we unconditionally surrendered to Him? Can we help you with that in some way? That's why we extend heaven's invitation, because if we're going to go to heaven, we've got to be unconditionally surrendered to Jesus Christ. Will you do that tonight? If so, come while we stand and sing to encourage you.